What if the narrative you have always accepted regarding Sherman's march on Atlanta is merely a fragment of the complete picture? Beneath the well-recorded battles and tactical movements lies a narrative filled with bold risks, intense rivalries, and critical choices that influence the destiny of a fractured nation. This account transcends the mere themes of Union victory or Confederate defiance. It resembles a high-stakes chess game where each action bore the potential for triumph or disaster. From clandestine strategies and daring maneuvers to significant setbacks and unexpected developments, we will explore the overlooked aspects of Sherman's campaign that are often absent from historical texts. Join us as we unveil the aspects of Sherman's march to Atlanta that history has neglected, for the reality is far more compelling than fiction. Before we proceed, please take a moment to like and subscribe to our channel to support our community. By late 1863, the Confederacy was facing significant challenges in maintaining its position. Their morale and ambitions had been severely impacted by a series of Union victories, including the unsuccessful Northern invasion at Gettysburg and Ulysses S. Grant's impressive win at Chattanooga. This success enabled the Union to take control of Tennessee, effectively dividing the Confederacy and inflicting a major setback on their war efforts. In contrast, despite facing issues such as inflation and labor shortages, the Northern economy was flourishing, and there was an increasing sense of advancement in the Union's military endeavors. In 1864, Union General William T. Sherman was convinced that a decisive offensive in Confederate territory could potentially end the war. By spring, he had received directives from Ulysses S. Grant to secure Atlanta, a city vital to the Confederate supply chain and overall strategy. On May 7th, Sherman and his forces entered Georgia and commenced their advance toward the Confederate troops positioned at Rocky Face Ridge. The forces were under the command of the esteemed and consistently victorious General Joseph E. Johnston. As Sherman's army neared Rocky Face Ridge, he sent a Union contingent led by Major General James McPherson towards Resaca through Snake Creek Gap, aiming to disrupt Johnston's supply lines and obstruct his retreat. While McPherson advanced towards Resaca, other Union troops engaged Confederate forces at Rocky Face Ridge and Buzzard's Roost on May 8th. By May 9th, McPherson's column arrived at Resaca, where they faced well-entrenched Confederate defenses. On May 10th, Sherman opted to bolster McPherson's troops by dispatching reinforcements from both the Army of the Cumberland and the Army of the Ohio to Resaca. As the conflict persisted at Rocky Face Ridge, Johnston became aware of Sherman's strategic movements and began relocating his forces towards Resaca on May 12th. The first significant confrontation of the Atlanta campaign took place on May 13th at the Battle of Resaca, where Federal forces engaged Confederate troops in intense combat. Upon McPherson's arrival, Confederate cavalry launched an offensive, but were ultimately repelled as Union forces secured Bald Hill after fierce fighting. Nevertheless, this victory proved to be fleeting. Concerned about a potential counteroffensive from Johnston's troops, McPherson made the decision to withdraw his forces to Snake Creek Gap, a choice that greatly disappointed Sherman. The following day, Sherman reached Resaca and commanded ongoing assaults to keep the Confederates occupied, while another division under Thomas W. Sweeney crossed the Oostenaula River in an effort to gain control of the railroad. On May 15th, realizing that Sweeney's forces had outflanked him, Johnston ordered his troops to retreat overnight. They crossed to the southern bank of the Oostenaula River, attempting to destroy the bridges behind them. However, their withdrawal was soon detected by Union forces, who pursued them and swiftly repaired the damaged bridges. By May 20th, Johnston's forces had arrived at Allatoona Pass, while Sherman and the Union Army continued their relentless pursuit. Instead of opting for a direct confrontation with the Confederates, Sherman sought to outflank them by focusing on their vulnerable left side. He intended to direct the Army of the Cumberland towards Dallas, Georgia. However, Johnston had foreseen this maneuver and strategically positioned his troops to obstruct the Federals at New Hope Church. Misjudging the strength of the Confederate forces, Sherman commanded Major General Joseph Hooker's troops to launch an attack on May 25th. This decision proved to be a tactical error. The challenging terrain and the well-fortified Confederate defenses rendered it impossible for Hooker's men to penetrate their lines. By May 27, Sherman opted to withdraw and redirect his efforts towards the Confederate right flank. To implement this revised strategy promptly, He ordered a corps under Major General Oliver Howard to engage the enemy's right flank on the same day. By that afternoon, Howard's corps had reached Pickett's Mill, where approximately 10,000 Confederate soldiers were entrenched. The battle began around 5 p.m. and raged fiercely into the night. As dawn broke the next day, the Confederates maintained their position and gained confidence after successfully repelling Union assaults on both flanks. Encouraged by this achievement, the Confederates initiated their own offensive. A contingent led by Major General William G. Hardee advanced towards Dallas, where Sherman's right flank was stationed. Combat erupted on May 28th as both sides hurriedly brought in reinforcements, intensifying the conflict and increasing casualties. Although the Confederates were ultimately pushed back, skirmishes continued around Dallas for several days thereafter. Determined to outmaneuver Johnston, Sherman made the decision to withdraw his forces from the Dallas region on June 1st and return to the Western and Atlantic Railroad for resupply. By June 19, Johnston's main army had fortified a strong defensive position just 25 miles from Atlanta at Kennesaw Mountain. The Confederate position was strongly fortified and arranged in a crescent formation. The right flank was located just north of Marietta, while the left extended southward near Cobb's Farm Plantation. The center of their line traversed southwest through Kennesaw Mountain. On June 22nd, following weeks of persistent rain that finally yielded to clear skies, Sherman made the decision to take decisive action. He instructed his forces to target the Confederate left flank in an attempt to cut off their access to the Western and Atlantic Railroad, which was a vital supply route for Johnston's army. The Confederate troops stationed at Cobb's Farm were led by Lieutenant General John Bell Hood. Without consulting Johnston first, Hood initiated an attack as Union forces approached his position. Unbeknownst to Hood, several Confederate skirmishers had been captured by the Union, who disclosed that an assault was imminent. As Hood advanced with his contingent of 11,000 men across marshy terrain, a larger Union force of 14,000 soldiers lay in ambush. The battle commenced at 5 p.m., but Hood's troops were swiftly outmaneuvered. His forces incurred approximately 1,000 casualties during the confrontation. Despite this setback for the Confederates, the Union forces were unable to make significant progress toward either Marietta or Atlanta. Faced with no other feasible options to penetrate the Confederate defenses, Sherman chose to abandon his usual flanking tactics and instead launch a direct assault on the fortified Confederate lines. This represented the first instance in the campaign where Sherman opted for a frontal attack. To preserve an element of surprise, he directed his commanders to keep the plan confidential, even from their staff officers. Despite the inherent dangers, Sherman formulated a strategy that included feints on both flanks to distract Johnston's attention while preparing for a central offensive. He directed his commanders to conduct simulated attacks on both flanks while concentrating their primary efforts on the center. Sherman recognized that this strategy might incur significant costs. However, he believed that the potential benefits outweighed the dangers associated with pursuing another flanking maneuver. The strategy involved McPherson's troops attacking the Confederate right flank at Pigeon Hill in Little Kennesaw, while Schofield's forces would assault the left flank near Ollie Creek. Concurrently, a larger Union contingent was to engage Hardee's corps, which was entrenched at Kennesaw Mountain. At dawn on June 27, Sherman's forces initiated their assault. Confederate artillery effectively repelled the Union troops advancing on their right flank, while Johnston's most formidable division, led by Major General Patrick Cleburne, successfully resisted the central attack. The Union commenced with a 15-minute artillery barrage before advancing their infantry, but the Confederate fortifications proved too resilient. Several Union commanders were incapacitated during the tumultuous assault, leading to disarray among their ranks. By midday, it became clear that Sherman's frontal attack had not succeeded. However, on July 2nd, Sherman successfully outflanked Johnston's left, compelling yet another Confederate retreat and bringing Union forces closer to Atlanta. Although Johnston's defensive tactics had effectively delayed Sherman's progress, his repeated withdrawals allowed Union troops to approach dangerously near to Atlanta. These retreats caused concern for Confederate President Jefferson Davis, who in mid-July opted to replace Johnston with Hood, recognized for his aggressive strategies. True to his reputation, Hood promptly initiated offensives against Sherman's forces. Nevertheless, despite several intense skirmishes, Hood was ultimately unable to prevent Sherman's relentless advance toward Atlanta. Earlier that year, upon discovering the Union's intentions to seize Atlanta, the Confederates had constructed two defensive fortifications around the city. Hood's strategy relied significantly on the use of enslaved laborers to accomplish the task at hand. After assuming command from Johnston, Hood designated Atlanta and its fortifications as his central base of operations. On the night of July 21st, he led his troops out of Atlanta, leaving two corps to safeguard the city's inner defenses. Hood's objective was to launch an attack on the rear of the Union lines, targeting their supply train, which would leave Union forces isolated deep within Confederate territory. Just before dawn on July 22nd, Sherman received intelligence indicating that Hood's forces had exited Atlanta's defensive perimeter. Although he was initially inclined to pursue Hood's army, Sherman ultimately opted against it after consulting with McPherson and receiving confirmation that Confederate troops still occupied Atlanta. Consequently, Sherman decided to maintain his current position. In anticipation of a possible assault, McPherson organized his 35,000 troops into an L-shaped formation, reinforced the line with trenches, and positioned artillery on Bald Hill. Unaware of McPherson's defensive measures, Hood maneuvered his men across difficult terrain in an effort to catch the Union forces off guard. However, delays resulted in Hood's infantry arriving at their designated position 6 hours later than intended. Due to a lack of precise intelligence regarding McPherson's location, Hood's forces found themselves positioned south of the Union's fortified left flank instead of behind it. Around midday, Hood's troops engaged with the Union line. As the Confederate offensive escalated, McPherson rode out to assess a vulnerable point where two sections of his line converged. During this inspection, he was spotted by Confederate soldiers and shot from his horse, succumbing to his injuries shortly thereafter. Despite the loss of their general at such a critical juncture, Union forces successfully maintained their position against Hood's onslaught. The Confederates were unable to seize Bald Hill, and the battle persisted into the evening until nightfall compelled Hood to retreat back into Atlanta. Although the Union experienced both personnel and territorial losses during the engagement, they effectively safeguarded their wagon train from destruction. Hood's offensive ultimately proved unsuccessful. By July 27, Sherman resumed his efforts to isolate Atlanta. Throughout the summer, skirmishes occurred around the city as both factions competed for dominance. By late August, Atlanta remained under the control of the Confederacy. While Union cavalry raids caused some disruption to Confederate infrastructure, several crucial supply lines continued to operate, sustaining Hood's forces. Acknowledging that a direct assault would not suffice to capture Atlanta, Sherman formulated a strategy to compel the Confederates to evacuate the city. Sherman concluded that targeting two essential railroads, the Macon and Western and the Atlanta and West Point lines, located south of Atlanta, would severely disrupt Hood's supply chain and necessitate an evacuation. As Union infantry advanced toward the railroad near Jonesboro in late August, Hood sent two corps under Hardee to intercept them. However, Hardee's troops were swiftly repelled during the confrontation on August 31st. Concerned about a potential large-scale Union attack on Atlanta, Hood recalled one corps to bolster the city's defenses that evening. On September 1st, Union forces decisively breached Hardee's line. With no viable alternatives left, Hood ordered the evacuation of Atlanta. The following day, September 2nd, 1864, Atlanta was surrendered to Union forces. Sherman had accomplished his goal. As the situation stabilized in Atlanta, Sherman's victory was recognized as a pivotal moment in the Civil War, delivering a significant setback to the Confederacy. Was it genuinely a victory of strategy, or did it signal a more ominous reality? The campaign resulted in a legacy of devastation, uprooted families, and a city left in shambles. While Sherman's march may have expedited the conclusion of the war, one must consider the price paid. Historians frequently laud his tactical genius, yet seldom do they ponder whether Sherman's approach to total war irrevocably altered America's ethical framework. Was his brutal efficiency a necessary measure, or did it establish a troubling precedent for the indiscriminate destruction of civilian lives in conflict? Moreover, if history is crafted by those who prevail, what essential truths regarding Sherman's march have been obscured over time? We invite your thoughts on this matter. Did Sherman preserve the Union, or did he incinerate something far more significant?